The value of the illegal drug market in the world is extremely hard to estimate due to the clandestine nature of the business. Yet the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime stated that the market is well in excess of $320 billion. These figures yet were released over a decade ago, and with the war on drugs still being fought on a global scale, it appears that all efforts to defeat the industry are failing as production goes up and prices come down.
The price has come down, it's more easily available, and so the access to a purer, cheaper form is largely fueling this resurgence or increase in the epidemic of heroin use among young people.
Because I guess it's like smoking.
Yet the effect on the users of the drugs is devastating, not only in the crime and violence associated with the trade, but also in the personal tragedies that come with being addicted to drugs.
Addiction is a full-time job. You wake up sick to have to find your first one that you can get so you can go just function throughout the day, to take care of your kids. It really is, and it completely managed my life for 6 years.
Hello and welcome to Economic Divide with me, Kavitah Waib. In this week's show, we will be diving into the gloomy underworld of the most profitable illegal business in the world, namely the drug trafficking industry. From cartels to street dealers, from users to government collaboration, the reach, cost, and impact of the trade is truly eye-opening. The drug crisis in the U.S. has continued in spite of the arrest of the Sinaloa cartel's Joaquin Guzman, or El Chapo, who no doubt led the largest drug supply organization into the U.S. from Mexico. Figures show that the impact of drugs is as great as ever, with more than 207,000 people overdosing from drugs in the U.S., with 70,000 alone dying in 2017. The economic cost of drug use in the U.S. is estimated to be in the region of $200 billion, with $120 billion going on lost productivity, $11 billion on healthcare costs, and $61 billion on criminal justice costs. Europe has not escaped the illegal drugs market, with the European Union market alone worth in the vicinity of 30 million euros per year, with a huge 30% of the market focusing on cannabis and another 30% on cocaine. Well, the drug trafficking business also affects the cartels running the trade, with violence being a key factor. In Mexico alone, more than 200,000 lives have been lost due to intra-cartel warfare, with 28,000 people still missing. As I'm sure you will agree, these figures make for a sad reading.
The trafficking of drugs is without doubt the largest illegal business in the world, with money being made in the billions. From the cocaine producers of Colombia, the opium fields of Afghanistan, the cannabis farms of Europe, and the synthetic chemical kitchens springing up everywhere, the drug industry is a market thriving on the misery of others. However, the sad fact of the matter is that the end users of any drug find themselves in a position that is very hard to get out of, with addiction being a major contributor to crime, as the addicts find ever more desperate ways to fund their habits, either through legitimate or illegal means.
I basically did whatever I had to do to get money. It didn't really matter. There was no discretion. I had no morals at all. I just did whatever I needed to do to get high.
For those that are addicted to drugs, the underlying problems are many, from poverty, inequality, poor social opportunities, lack of education, and a whole host of others. It seems that the common denominator for drug users is that they were running away from something, and that drugs were the only source of blocking out the pain.
It comes in the form of powder, and then I throw liquid on it, water, and then I cook it up and then I inject it. Basically for me it is only to take the pain away.
Once a person falls into the perils of being an addict, the impact on their life is devastating. The collapse of the family, the health problems, the solitude and the neglect all begin to add up, leaving the user down and out, whilst the traffickers and producers of the drugs reap the rewards of the illegal market. In the US, for example, from the number of people convicted of a crime, 1 in 4 had committed the crime in order to fund their drug habit. Currently, around 20% of US inmates in prison are detained due to drug-related issues, With the drug problem reaching epidemic proportions around the world, the economic consequences of the problem are far more destructive to the lower end of the social ladder than to the producers and the top dog dealers of the drugs whose lavish lifestyles are fit for Hollywood movies.
The cultivation of drugs is on the rise, with the opium poppy seeing a 130% increase between the years 2009 and 2018, with coca bush production increasing 34% during the same time. And the number of people now using drugs have also seen a rise of 30%, contributing to the annual $652 billion a year illegal drug industry. People in the U.S. alone have seen spending on drugs hit record figures, with $150 billion being spent on things like cocaine, heroin, marijuana, and meth. And that's just in the year 2016. Yet with many states now looking at legalizing marijuana, the price of the drug has come down, whilst the consumption has risen. Colombia is no doubt the largest producer of cocaine production in the world, with the nation making over 1,379 tons of cocaine for the year 2017, which was up 31% from the previous year. However, the 2017 peak appears to have been a high, as records indicate a 20% reduction in cocaine for the year 2019. And finally, some countries are using the income from illicit drugs to push up their GDP figures. The UK has used this creative accounting technique to add as much as £65 billion into their overall GDP. That's a 5% increase on the true figure in order to simulate growth and impress investors. Yet many critics say the GDP in the UK includes many things that it shouldn't.
In 1971, President Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs, and since that time, the US alone have spent over $1 trillion on drug prevention and incarceration. Yet, the problem persists. The US in 2014 announced that American drug users had spent over $100 billion on illegal drugs in the past decade, costing the taxpayer around $193 billion in lost productivity, which includes the likes of healthcare, education, criminal justice and prevention. When this is compared to other budgets in the US, such as the $39 billion on energy and $29 billion on science, we can see that the cost of drugs are wider than just the prevention and detection alone. How individual states deal with drug traffickers and users varies widely across the globe. The US, as we know, relies heavily on penitentiary correction facilities, which in reality are just breeding grounds for further violations and drug use and distribution. But Trump believes his border wall between the US and Mexico is a key contributor to stemming the flow of drugs into the states, although this just may be a sly way of justifying his anti-immigrant rhetoric behind the wall.
The impact that we've had between opioid and all of the other problems we have with drugs, different drugs than we had 10, 15, 20 years ago, much different, but also the drugs coming in through the border. We've had a great impact.
The Philippines appear to have caused some controversy in their dealing with drug users and suppliers. The President, Rodrigo Duterte, took an extreme approach to the issue with the ordering of the execution of those involved.
The fight will not stop until those who deal in it understand that they have to cease, they have to stop, because the alternative are either jail or hell.
Figures show that thousands have been killed, not necessarily by Duterte's team, but by some vigilantes using the laissez-faire policy imposed by the president in his aim to eliminate drugs from the Philippines. Needless to say, many oppose this extreme methodology.
Most of us Filipinos, even if we support the war on drugs, we do not support extrajudicial killings.
But some, on the other hand, admire it.
Some countries have a very, very tough penalty, the ultimate penalty. And by the way, they have much less of a drug problem than we do.
Joining us now is Mohan Abedin, current affairs and impact analyst, in order for us to discuss some current issues. Mohan, we're looking at the coronavirus. It's not going away. The hit that the world economy at this point has taken, based on some figures, is $1.1 trillion. Give us an idea of the scope of this, whether you agree with this in terms of it being analyzed, that the world economy has taken such a big hit?
Well, I'm not sure if that's the projected figure or that's the the cost already incurred. But if it's a projected one, I'm not at all surprised, because look, it's practically shut down the world's biggest country and the world's second largest economy. Now the Chinese, interestingly, are coming out and saying Corona will be contained by April, fully contained. If that's the case, then perhaps it won't be so dramatic.
How can they gauge something like this when the source of it, which is China, and them being affected, then it gets translated to other countries? We know a lot of countries depend on China and their products. Obviously, the manufacturers.
There's a lot of travel, and the incubation period could be, I don't know, between 7 to 14 days from what I heard, and a lot of people travel to China. So, but anyway, the source of the virus, we must be fair. The Chinese are doing everything they can to contain it to that, Wuhan province. The Hubei province and Wuhan, the city of Wuhan in particular. So if they're successful in containing it by April, then we can, it won't be so catastrophic.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see. This is a developing story. Let's move on to India. A lot of stories on India, but this one in particular obviously is noteworthy because of the fact that it's overtaken France and the UK, 7% GDP growth, which is quite astounding. Now, this goes against what I read just weeks ago, that it had actually contracted the Indian economy. So I'm not too sure how all of a sudden it's up to 7%. Well, the contraction was somewhere around hovering around the 5% mark.
I'm not so full with the specifics, but I think looking at the trajectory here over the past decade or so, that figure doesn't really surprise me. I mean, India is clearly going to be an economic giant. Interestingly, the UK Prime Minister 10 years ago, David Cameron, he went to India, and with the idea of fully aligning with India. This is something that the British elites have been saying for a long time. So interesting to see if the UK, freed from Brexit, is going to try to tilt toward that, more toward that axis. But the really big news there is that the UK is no longer the world's 5th largest economy.
Mohammadin, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
As usual, a pleasure. Okay, time for a quick break. Coming up, we are going to take a look at the drug market in the United Kingdom and hear how some residents in the UK are relying on drug sales to bring themselves out of poverty. Also look at the rise of violence in the UK, in particular within the inner cities, where drug-related violence has seen over 100 people killed last year, with 13 already dying in the first month of 2020 due to drug-related knife crimes. Also look into the world of drug cartels, state involvement with drug dealing, and how the US and Israeli military have also been involved in that. Also joined by Professor Benjamin Smith from the University of Warwick with his insights on the drug cartels and impact on North America. So don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back with me, Kavita Ahway. Joining me in this part of the program is Benjamin Smith, a professor of Latin American history at the University of Warwick. He's written extensively on Mexican society, studied the drug trafficking industry in the Americas. Professor Smith, thanks for joining me. I would like to start by asking you how important Mexico is as a hub for drug trafficking, and why are cartels so powerful in their operations and business?
Well, in terms of how important it is, around 90% of the cocaine that goes into the United States comes from Mexico. The vast majority of the heroin, now the new kind of version of heroin, which is something called fentanyl, which is synthetic heroin. A lot of that is being transported through Mexico, and it used to be about 90% of US marijuana, so it's extremely important. In terms of why the cartels are so important, well, principally it is that enormous amounts of demand, but it's also been because of a degree of tacit agreements between parts of the Mexican government and the cartels.
Well, there appears to be a clear divide between the social classes in the U.S. when it comes to using drugs. Why are poor communities falling into the trap of becoming drug users and dealers?
On the surface, there is an enormous gap. This is because principally poorer people are prosecuted far more than richer people. So, for example, if police forces want to up their numbers on drug arrests, they tend to go to poorer neighborhoods where a lot of the drug sales are done on the streets, rather than, say, raiding a middle or upper middle class university where you'd probably get more drug busts. So that's partly a bit of the figures are somewhat deceptive. But there is a reason why poor people take drugs in the United States is effectively because the manufacturing industry in the United States frankly went down the toilet during the 1980s and has yet to recover. So there's very few job opportunities for many people.
Well, key players in the drug industry, such as Pablo Escobar and Joaquin Guzman, have given the industry a Hollywood-esque image. Do you think the portrayal of drug lords in this way is sending the wrong message?
To a certain extent. I mean, one thing that you do notice that even when you go and meet drug traffickers in Mexico, the Scarface movie and the Godfather movie are still incredibly popular. But do remember, at the end of Narcos, if at the end of El Chapo, he's in jail. At the end of Narcos, Pablo Escobar's dead. At the end of Scarface, he's dead. The Godfather dies, admittedly, relatively peacefully, but a lot of the people around him don't. So I'm not sure that it really sends out a particularly poor message. Most of these characters in the films die. I think what is more problematic about these films is that it tends to heroize the counter-narcotics agents, often who basically deal out just as much violence towards drug traffickers as drug traffickers deal out towards each other or to the agents themselves, and they don't help the matter. But in these films, they're made out to be these noble heroes, where often they're not.
Professor Benjamin Smith there from the University of Warwick, thank you for joining us. Now the UK has been labelled as the drugs market of Europe, with many forms of drugs being trafficked into the nation from various routes. Crime rate has increased dramatically, with London at one point having more homicides than New York in the year 2019. What effect then is the drug trafficking market having on the UK?
The United Kingdom has a major drugs problem, with the island nation being labelled as the drugs market of Europe. It's been estimated that the cost of the UK in dealing with the drug industry is around £10.7 billion per year, and this in an attempt to control a drug market worth in the region of £6 billion a year. But with the UK sinking further and further into poverty due to the post-Brexit slump, many people in the UK are turning to illegal activities to fund themselves, with poorer communities in the UK being one of the most abundant places in which drugs are bought and consumed.
What I've got here is some cocaine. I paid £250 for this. Once I sell this, I'll get back 600, maybe 650. 4 of these get sold about a week. This is the weekend business, and one of these alone covers the rent.
But with the production and dealing of drugs comes a risk of violence, and London has seen its crime rates go through the roof, with the number of stabbings and murders relating to the gang culture surrounding dealing drugs in the UK being a major problem, with 110 killed in 2019 and already 13 recorded in 2020.
How you protect yourself? Well, you have to be equipped. I pull out my tool. 5 times in his face. His face was like a pineapple.
But with the market in the UK saturated from drugs across the world, the selection is very wide.
We've got heroin mainly coming in from Afghanistan, through Iran, Turkey, and through the Balkans. We've got cocaine coming in from South America, through Portugal, Spain, but also kind of West Africa. We've got drugs like ecstasy and amphetamine from laboratories a lot nearer home, crossing the channel from Holland and Belgium. And within the UK, we've got a lot of homegrown cannabis and laboratories producing tranquilizers like diazepam.
The problem in the UK has spread out of the main cities and into the suburban towns and villages, with the drug traffickers operating the so-called county line routes, which according to the National Crime Agency makes the dealers around £500 million per year.
Well, ironically, a lot of it has started because of the levels of violence between gangs in the inner cities. So some of them began to move out of the inner cities to smaller towns and cities. They would sell their supply of drugs to local dealers, and then they would go home again. But that's changed now, whereby they will actually go into more rural and small town areas and actually take over the dealing network themselves.
Europe as a continent is placed in the crossroads of the global drug trafficking world, with opiates coming in from the east and cocaine coming in from the west. top of this, Europe has its own drug production, from cannabis to amphetamines and from synthetic drugs to ecstasy. So let's take an in-depth look at Europe's drug problems. Well, the value of the European drug market is estimated at around 12 billion euros per year, with cannabis being the leading drug produced, sold, and used at around 2,000 tons per year. 61 tons of cocaine has hit the shores of Europe from South America, with the trafficking route coming in by land and sea to Spain. Albanian gangs appear to have dominated the cocaine trade in Europe, almost monopolizing the supply in certain European countries. Now, around 84 million Europeans have used cannabis, with over 17 million using cocaine and 12 million trying amphetamines. Of the users, around 7,000 deaths occurred around Europe due to drug overdoses, a figure that is on the rise due to emerging synthetic drugs and the reliance on more powerful drugs to feed the habits. So let's take a look at some of the cartels responsible for the trafficking of these drugs, and also look at how certain countries are abusing their power in the distribution of drugs.
Probably one of the most famous routes of trafficking drugs is via the cartels that have seen billions of dollars made by the dealers who run the operations on an international scale, with almost state-like organization behind it. The likes of Pablo Escobar and Joaquin Guzman, or El Chapo, have inspired Hollywood movies and TV series following their careers, with El Chapo's family now launching a line of merchandise celebrating the Mexican kingpin leader of the Sinaloa cartel, who twice escaped prison before being extradited to the US. Figures suggest that the Sinaloa cartel alone has a global network across the world and shares up to 60% of the $29 billion of drug sales in the US, and has been part of the international 150,000 homicides that have occurred in the cartel wars since 2006 in order to gain dominance in the business.
This conviction, we expect, will bring a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. It is a sentence from which there is no escape and no return. This conviction is a victory for the American people, who has suffered so long and so much, while Guzman made billions pouring poison over our southern border.
Needless to say, the arrest of El Chapo has not stopped the Sinaloa cartel from operating. Interestingly, however, it's not just the cartels that are in on the act, with governments and military entities also playing a part in the drug trafficking game. Examples have seen US Special Forces soldiers arrested for their part in a $1 million cocaine smuggling attempt from Colombia to the US aboard US military aircraft, as well as seeing Israeli military officers actively dealing drugs along the border with Egypt. Furthermore, drugs have become a huge problem in Israel, with the number of cocaine users doubling, and seeing Israeli criminals joining hands with the cartels in order to supply drugs to the region, and see the Israeli regime launder money into the military and other various entities within the state. The war on drugs against the cartels, the dealers and the users is all in vain in reality, as the true picture suggests that it's done nothing more than to make governments more powerful, citizens less free, and has created a tsunami of death and destruction as traffickers and gangs continue to spread the drugs to the poorest and most deprived people of the world.
The drug trafficking business has brought about billions of dollars to the suppliers, leaving the users of the drug stagnated into a life of addiction, crime, and desperation. Nation-states spend billions of dollars fighting drug trafficking, yet many state that the war on drugs is a total failure, as producers always remain one step ahead of the authorities, attempting to stem the flow. The effects of drugs are life-changing, with many deaths, violence, and crime directly related to the industry. Yet the divide between the users and the suppliers remains no more than a street corner away as the trade goes on. If you would like to share a story with us about the issues that you find important, please do not hesitate to get in touch with us using the hashtag #ED_program. Our contact details are on your screens now. If you'd like to see the show again or catch up with any of our past episodes, just log on to our website and click on Economic Divide. Be sure to leave a comment about the show. And that's it for another edition of Economic Divide. I've been your host, Kaveh Taghwaee, and on behalf of myself and the whole team here on the show, thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.